Simon Assaf. Simon Assaf is a journalist based in London. He's originally from Lebanon. And he's speaking tonight as part of an organisation called MENA, which is the Middle East and North African Solidarity Network. And this was an organisation set up in the early days of the Egyptian uprising. And it brought together a group of people nationally here in Britain who wanted to show solidarity to what was happening in the Middle East and see what they could do to help. So Simon's going to talk about the political implications of what's happening in Syria and the wider region.
Thank you very much. Thank you, brother. Thank you very much for inviting me to Manchester as well. I just wanted to say that I think these days are very hard, and I think it's very easy for us, both here and in Syria, to simply slip into despair and see that this is going to be a never-ending war, or that the revolution is gone and is finished, and that this has now become a sectarian civil war in which we will not see the end of it. And of course, coming from a Lebanese, this, must seem strange, because, Nahla was asking me how I introduce myself. I will say I'm Lebanese, because in my heart, when we came as refugees in 1975, we were only staying for a month. And 40 years later, here I still am. My daughter's grown up, and so on. And so, but still, that thing remains. We have to be against despair, and then we have to look at the revolution and understand that however difficult these days are, that there is something happening inside of Syria that I think is going to change it and mark it for the future. And this is what the people in Syria are fighting for. And this is, I think, the fundamental reason why all the good people around the world support the Syrian revolution. I was going to say something about those who simply dismiss the Syrian revolution and the Syrian people as simply being pawns in some greater game. The idea that the Syrian revolution, even some people say it might have started off with good intentions, but since it's been taken over by Saudi Arabia, Qatar, the US, Israel, Al-Qaeda, I mean, you name it, there's a huge long list. So I say it's complete nonsense. That there is something called Syria, and there is this, and it is a real thing. And there is the will of the people inside of Syria, which is real, and it remains so. And they have interests outside of all these others. It always made me laugh, because when people talk about these simply, and the way they do it, I think, is really dishonest. That you look at Iraq, and what's happening in Syria is what happened in Iraq. Well, it's not. Because in Iraq there was an invasion of 250,000 troops. In Syria this is an uprising. And so then they try and say that the people of Daraa, or the people of Idlib, are simply somehow pawns in this game, or simply playing and part of it, as if they were recruited by CIA or something in a bar in Shanghai or something. It's complete and utter ridiculous. It is a real uprising, and as a real uprising it needs no justification. And it certainly needs no excuse. And we don't go putting conditions on the Syrian people for our support. Our support is with them and with their uprising. And I think for me this is the beginning. This has to be absolutely the beginning there. I want to say something else, that I think the victory is coming. And I don't just say that simply because after years of civil war in Lebanon you see the end coming, that somehow I'm just overwhelmingly optimistic, which I am overwhelmingly optimistic, but actually because you begin to see it on the ground. That actually 80% of Syria is now under the hands of the rebels, the revolutionaries. The key centres, military bases, and so on, the regime still has hold of. And they're using these bases in order to indiscriminately bomb areas that have gone over to the revolution. We're seeing it, we saw it in Homs, I think, in the most horrible way, but we're seeing it now everywhere else. And the recent phenomena of rolling barrels of TNT out the back of helicopters indiscriminately onto buildings to take down a building shows you, I think, the desperation of the regime. But it also shows you something else. That when the July offensive happened, and large numbers of resistance fighters and rebels poured into Aleppo, people were saying this wouldn't last. That there was huge numbers of troops now coming to clear out Aleppo. Actually, something emerged, which is the regime cannot trust its soldiers. Actually, if you see what's taking place inside the Syrian army, you know that there are hundreds, if not thousands, if not hundreds of thousands, of ordinary Syrian conscripts who are being held almost as prisoners inside these military bases, and they dare not let them go. Because the moment they let them go, they go home or they join the rebellion. And if they try then stick large numbers of troops, these troops tend to defect. And I think this shows you that even though it's hard, even though it's very bloody, that actually there is this huge wheel that is turning inside of Syria. I think that's really really important. That I think we are beginning to see the end. And of course, nothing, the darkest moment before dawn, as they say. And I think we're feeling now that darkest moment, and we should not let go of that dream of what it means by Syrian people are one, the Syrian people are united, but also that they want Syria, which is free, with people living in dignity. And I think that's really, really important. And there's the others who say that this is a sectarian uprising. I'll tell you something. The Sunnis make up, what, 65, 70% of the population. This was a sectarian uprising. It would have been over months ago. Because actually all the Sunnis would have risen up and simply slaughtered the Alawis. This is complete nonsense. Of course it's complete nonsense. There are large sections, especially the Sunni rich and Sunni upper middle classes, who are very happy with the state of play. There's also vast numbers of Alawis who are extremely unhappy with the regime and what the regime is doing and how it's putting him in the position that it's putting him. I saw a very good report by a man called Mir Rosen, where he went amongst the Alawis. Very, very good report, because I recognised something in it which took me back to my youth, because we're from Christian Lebanon. So at the beginning of our civil war, or our armed uprising that turned into a civil war, I heard this all the time. It's simply about the Muslims. They want to slaughter us. Look at us, how Western we are, and so on. And I recognise this. And I also recognise how false this was. Because, of course, if you look into Syrian history, those amongst the Alawi community who opposed the Assaf regime, the Ba'athist regime, usually suffered twice as hard as everyone else, and everyone else did suffer. It is, sectarianism is not something coming out of the revolution. This is the tool they use to try and break the revolution. I think we have to understand very much how this works inside this sectarian system that they have. It is rich and poor, and you see this very much in the areas. And you see also large numbers of Alawis as well. If you go into southern Beirut, I was there in the last summer, and it was a very interesting thing I saw. Southern Beirut, of course, the Shia heartlands, Hezbollah strongholds, a place that was hammered mercilessly by the Israelis in 2006 and so on. There was a slogan on the wall, written, and as you passed by, you saw it everywhere. It was a victory to the revolution in Bahrain. This is acceptable inside the Shia areas. Underneath it, victory to the revolution in Syria. And actually, people see this revolution, especially amongst many sections of the Lebanese population. Also, large numbers of young Shias as well, who see this as a genuine revolution and are furious with what is taking place in the way sectarianism is attempting to be used. The Syrian Revolution is part of the Arab Spring. It's not simply part of the Arab Spring because it happened at the same time as the rest of the revolutions, but actually the things that drove the development of the Syrian Revolution are the same that drove the revolutions everywhere else. And I want to spend maybe 5 minutes, hopefully, just explain what I mean by that. That if you look at the Arab Spring, there's something that strikes you. That you have an uprising in Tunisia. Okay, acceptable. This is a pro-Western regime and so on. Followed by an uprising in Egypt. Acceptable also. This is a pro-Western regime. And then suddenly there's an uprising in Libya. And you're going, well, is this a coincidence? Or is actually, this is supposed to be an anti-imperialist regime, yet the people are rising. And then in Yemen, and then in Bahrain. And then you see it's now going to Sudan, where it actually is an Islamist regime. It's nothing to do with the nature of the regime. It has to do with the nature of the massive social changes that have taken place inside the Arab world over the last 30 years. And I hope to kind of illustrate this, and you see it in Syria as well. You see it everywhere, which is when I was growing up in Lebanon in the 1960s, early 1970s, 2/3 of the population lived on the land. We lived in villages, really. A tiny minority, were living in the cities and so on. It's the same across everywhere else. And in the village, it's very easy to keep people under control. And it's very, very easy. Just seeing my grandmother was enough to keep me under control. But actually, that we lived in a Greek Orthodox village, and then we had nothing to do, never mind with the Shia villages, but we had nothing to do with the Maronite villages. Everyone was kept separate from everyone else. City life is different. You go into the city, you walk down the road, you meet everyone. So when we moved from the village into Beirut, suddenly I was meeting people I'd never thought I'd meet. Even, when you grow up inside this kind of sectarian system, the people who really kind of hated, apart from the Maronites, obviously, were the Greek Catholics. I had no idea who the Greek Catholics were, but we weren't supposed to like them because we were Orthodox. And this breaks down very, very quickly. If you look at the Arab world, you'll see, over the last 30, 40 years, a massive shift from the countryside to the city. So now when we talk about the Arab world, we're not talking about tribes wandering around deserts or people simply on the land. Actually, we're talking about it being very urban. Saudi Arabia, 80% urban. Okay. Lebanon, 80, 90% urban. Egypt, 50, 60% urban. And every single place you look, you'll see this. The second thing that happened, which was a massive change in education. And we talk simply about Libya in the 1950s, where it was something like 10, 15% people can read and write. Really, it was as bad as that. Actually, now they talk about 90%. Actually, there are these fundamental changes that have taken place, but most importantly, once you get into the city, then you start finding your power. And what we saw in Syria, I think, over the last 10, 15 years has been this shift more and more from the countryside into the city. And they talk about the new neighbourhoods around Aleppo and Damascus and so on. I think the figure, someone might correct me if I'm wrong, was something like 2 to 3 million people simply over the last decade moving over from one to the other. There's something else. These massive social changes have no reflection with the regimes at the top. So even though Libya today is completely different to Libya in 1969, it was still run by the same man. Same with Egypt. Same with, you can go every country you want, irrespective of what it calls itself, Republican or a monarchy or whatever. These regimes emerged from a different era, from the 1950s, from the 1960s, some from the 1930s, and Lebanon, of course, from the 1932. They remain completely unchanged, but their population underneath have changed fantastically. And so you had, inside of the Arab world, this massive build-up of pressure, huge build-up of pressure, in which there was this sense something needed to happen. Something needed to change inside the Arab world, but the regimes would not allow it. There is another aspect, I think, that we have to understand with this, is that these regimes rested on 3 pillars. The first pillar was a social contract between the regimes and the population. Okay, you shut up, or you won't go hungry. You shut up, we'll subsidise your fuel. Don't say anything. Never mind, we'll ensure your children have an education and so on. This was, again, across all the regions. Something began to change in the some places in the 1970s, but really in the 1990s to 2000, which is the advent of neoliberalism. We all know what neoliberalism means here, but you just see what it meant in the Middle East. The cut in bread subsidies, the cut in fuel subsidies, the abolition even of the most meagre social provisions actually meant you began to see large sections of the Arab population go from that just on the cusp of being in trouble to suddenly finding themselves in deep trouble. At the same time this was taking place, you had a massive rise in wealth amongst the upper echelons of the regimes. You know, the Egyptians joke, and they said, oh, we found 80 billion in the bank account of Hosni Mubarak. People go, oh, stop exaggerating, it was 20 billion. And the same with Gaddafi. How much money did they manage to put in their own pockets? Actually, if you look across the whole of the Arab world and actually see that class, the rich have become so extraordinarily stupid rich, but the majority of the population seem unable to lift themselves. In fact, have been pushed further and further down. This neoliberalism actually demolished one important pillar of the regimes, and that was to keep people in acquiescence. You can shut me up. Okay. So I only got the first point. Okay, so there's the second pillar. The second pillar I call the rhetoric. And anyone, I'm sure, most of the Arabs here will know, I'm sure other people know as well, is that you would go along to these conferences in which you get the long speeches. Our brothers, the Palestinians, the imperialism, and so on and so on. This was the rhetoric. The rhetoric about Palestine was very important. Because at the same time as they were having this rhetoric, praising our brothers, and they were suppressing the Palestinian popular movement. And there is no regime more adept at smashing the Palestinian popular movement than Hafez al-Assad's regime and the one that followed. Because from Lebanon, when I think about the civil war, and at the time we were fighting against what we call the progressive forces. We were, relatively wealthy Christians, and we didn't want the poor people to come and take. So, wrong side. Sorry about that, but that's just the way it was at the time. But I remember the one thing was that we feared the Syrian army coming. Because if the Syrians came, then we knew that the end of the Christian domination of Lebanon would happen. The communists would take over. Before you know it, we'll all be speaking with a Palestinian accent. This was the general feeling amongst them. So when the Syrian army did invade, we were completely shocked. It invaded to stop the victory of the Palestinian progressive movement. This was 1976. It was a huge surprise to us. Absolutely huge surprise, because this is not what we were expecting. Actually, what was taking place was that the same process that was taking place inside of Egypt, which was Sadat at the time, who was the ruler of Egypt, attempting to cut a deal with the Americans, with the Israelis. Hafez al-Assad was doing the same as well. And part of that deal was to suppress the uprising inside of Lebanon. So when the Syrian army came into Lebanon, they came into Lebanon to destroy the Palestinian movement and to destroy the left and the progressive forces. This is an absolute fact. And it was summed up for me in one thing that was very important to us at the time, a place called Tel Zata, which is a Palestinian camp. Because of course we were terrified of it, because we were on the wrong side. But a few years later I realised it was ridiculous. Tal al-Za'atar was holding out this Palestinian camp, a centre of resistance inside the industrial belt outside Beirut. It cut the supply lines from the rich mountains to the Phalangist sectarian militias in Beirut. The Syrian army shelled it. In shelling it, they then allowed in the Phalangist militia, and what happened next, of course, we've seen time and time again. They did the same in 1983. They did the same in what we call the War of the Camps. I have a Palestinian friend, actually she now lives in London, who's a survivor of Srebrenica of 1982. And you talk to her about it, but she doesn't want to talk about that. I expect this from the Israelis, she said, but I lost my brother in 1984. What happened to him? He was PLO, he got kidnapped by the Syrian regime because they were trying to crush the PLO at the time. She never saw him again. So for her, the deep anger is not simply against the Israelis, but the way in which this betrayal happened, the way in which the regime was used to crush any movement outside of its control. And that's something I think is very important we understand, because there's people who simply see it as being the axis of resistance, or simply seeing it as being that. No, there is a double history. It was forced at certain times to take up a stand against Israel, but actually most of the time it was attempting to crush completely the movement underneath. And this is not simply Syria, this is the rest of the Arab world. So you had the rhetoric and the promises, which came to nothing. And the biggest promise was the promise about a two-state solution. We will keep the Arab street quiet. We will ensure there will be a two-state solution. We will say there will be no return for the Palestinians to pre-48 Palestine and so on. In return, you Americans and the Israelis will give us an independent Palestinian state, even though it's only Gaza and the West Bank. This was a big promise. I remember a big promise, the 1990s. Everyone felt it, and you felt you were being lied to. But actually, when it actually came to the fact that you were lied to, people were absolutely disgusted. That all the promises of the Arab regimes, irrespective of their colour, still made the same promise, still made the same, broke the same promise. Neither, as they say in Daraa, in the south where the revolution in Syria began, when they called on the troops the heroes of repression, the cowards of the Golan. This is, I think, exactly what it means, that they were willing constantly to use weapons against their own population, but not stand up against the Israelis. This sense, I think, of betrayal was very, very strong. So I think that's important. That's the second pillar. And you felt that pillar crumble as well. The regimes only had one pillar left, which was just sheer brute repression. Because they had no legitimacy, they lost any sense of connection with the population, so the only thing they could rely on was on the security services. And so when you saw the nature of the Arab revolution, the nature of the uprisings that took place, they took a very peculiar character, which was mass demonstrations in the streets, breaking the holds of security forces. So you saw this in Libya, then you saw it massively inside of Egypt. It is, if you like, the reason why there is this level of brutality. So there is that sentiment. There is something else I think we have to say about the Syrian revolution, which it is very much a revolution that has come from below. And the more you look into it, the more I think I'm amazed at the speed at which it developed. The original demonstrations were coordinated by something called the local coordination committees and various other what they call Syrian revolutionary organisations. These come from below. They organically grew out of the street movements and very quickly began to develop a revolutionary leadership inside of Syria. The LCCs called a whole series of peaceful demonstrations. There were demonstrations, and it was amazing really, to be honest with you, of all the events in world history. I think Syria is probably the most documented. You can watch every single demonstration on YouTube. It's quite amazing, and I do, basically, because I'm obsessed with it. and it's very, very interesting about it, is A, the sense, the depth of it, B, the sense of which this is popular, that these are ordinary people. You hear it in the accents and the areas and so on. And the third thing, that strikes you constantly, is the Syrian people are one. That chant, the Syrian people are one. People talk about sectarianism, I don't hear it. I'm sure there must be, but I don't hear it in the mass demonstrations. This movement, this peaceful movement, about the demonstrations, around the demonstrations, and also the general strikes that followed, exposed the fact that the regime in Syria could not be reformed. It could not provide any reforms at all. This is the reason why then revolution becomes the only option. It's not like they woke up one morning and said, oh, what should we do? Should we have a peaceful movement for reform? And Bashar al-Assad leaves and we have this process like in Egypt or something? Or do we just have a violent revolution? This wasn't a choice. The violent element of it actually came out of the regime. The way in which the regime responded to these demonstrations meant there was really no alternative. Whether people will talk about the timing or the nature, this of course is up for the debate, but that they had to I think became extraordinarily quickly. So when we talk about the revolution as being a living organism, that's something that is constantly emerging. And you read reports, especially from areas inside what they call the liberated areas, where people talk about, I think in one village, they have elections every 3 months for who is going to run the village. That's fantastic. Because you've gone for years in which you have false elections with one candidate, and everyone has to vote for that candidate, and some people are so enthusiastic, they vote twice, it's one of those kind of regimes. Actually, people having secret ballots. That's fantastic. People actually beginning to put under popular control the civil administration that is taking place in some kind of accountable way. And I think this is really important. You see this over and over again. You see the documents now beginning to appear in which this is becoming the blueprint, the model of what Syria under the liberated areas will look like. And you begin to see it, of course, still surviving despite the terrible conditions under which it's going. And then there's the question, I think, about the armed resistance. People talk about the armed resistance. I think it's very important that we distinguish between what we call the real resistance organisations, the brigades as they call them, that emerged out of the revolution. Usually from defected troops, defected officers, civilians, students, workers, so on, taking up weapons to defend their neighbourhoods, and that this grew and became bigger and more important. That is coming from below. And you see this, and people talk about the numbers of this. They talk about maybe 70, 80,000 men, normally men, under arms who are fighting back, and fighting back more and more effectively. Because, when they talk about the Syrian army, it's an army designed to withstand a war with Israel. So actually, the amount of stocks they have are for a 2-year war with Israel. Just to give you a sense of how much weapons are being thrown at the Syrian people. So it is very much how they're able to, under these conditions, win over soldiers, get weapons, and so on. There is that element of it, in which we say, 70, 80,000, maybe it's more, maybe it's slightly less. But people concentrate on the Salafis, on the people coming from Iraq and so on, and they go, look, they're coming to take over. Let's get this in perspective, that these are tiny, tiny amounts of people. It's not the main bulk of it. And then there's the others who talk about the so-called Western-backed leadership of the Free Syrian Army and the various others. And there was a very good report, very good because it made me laugh. I think it was in Telegraph yesterday, in which they talked about the Saudi millions going in to rebuild the Syrian revolution. I don't have to read this, obviously. The Saudi millions going in. And they did a report about this brigade that's being funded by the Saudis and so on. And he's thinking, oh, it's very good, etc., interesting. Oh, I have to, a little bit worried about it and so on. You read the end and go, how big is this brigade? There's 20 people. And then 20 people, how much are you spending? 20 million, 30 million on 20 people? Actually, if you think of just one brigade in Homs, we're talking about 10,000. So actually, we have to think very quickly, very importantly, between the little fringe things people focus on, and actually the core of the revolution, itself. Another 5 minutes, and then I promise I'll shut up. And so we have, if you like, inside of this, quite a harsh and nasty civil war. I use the word civil war in the traditional way. That is, civilians fighting against the state. This is the original term, rather than a sectarian civil war. It's not a sectarian civil war. It's really important that we make that distinction. Because the origins of the revolution was not a sectarian, or if people take their minds back to Yugoslavia, this started as a sectarian war and continued as a sectarian war. This is not what is taking place in Syria. Of course, sectarianism is a danger. Of course it is. We know that. It's our punishment in Syria and Lebanon. In these places, our punishment for failure. We will get sectarianism, but it's not something that emerges from the revolution, from the revolution itself. And we have to say, I think, something else. It's just stuff about Western intervention. Because as much as I deeply support the Syrian revolution, and I expect everyone here does as well, we have to be extraordinarily weary of what the West is playing and how they see it. It's very important to understand that their influence inside the revolution is extraordinarily limited. And I don't just say this because I want it to be the case, but because you read the documents, and what's interesting about them is that they draw up lists of people. This is, the documents they publish and say, maybe we can talk to this commander, maybe this one will talk to us, maybe that one will talk. Actually, they don't have that much influence at all. But also this sense, I think, from inside of Syria, in which Western intervention didn't come, it's not going to come, it has to come from us. It's very important that the Western military intervention doesn't happen for several reasons. One is, the revolution, the legitimacy of the revolution is not simply about today or tomorrow this year. It's about the next 30, 40 years. This is very important. That it is seen as not being brought from the outside, but comes from the society as well. The legitimacy, I think, is very, very important. But for me, I think the overwhelming thing is, what the hell are you going to bomb? Because if you look inside the military bases, these are prisons. Do we really want Western aircraft bombing conscript prisoners? No, we don't. At all. We don't want that at all. Nor do we want Syria simply to become like Iraq. That is, people coming from the outside, taking control and leaving disaster. This has to come and remain from the inside. I'm happy for all humanitarian aid to come in. Don't get me wrong, it's not like, this aspirin is from, Western company can't come in. I think that should actually come in. But direct Western intervention will destroy the revolution. It's very important that that doesn't happen. The other thing I think is really, really important is that we understand that inside of this revolution, however hard it is now, that there still remains that beating heart. It still remains that massive desire, and it still remains that the revolution itself develops and deepens. That the way in which the local coordinating committees now become the civil administration, the way in which, when you see the footage coming out, what they call the leaked footage from the Shabiha, the regime forces and so on, you see the barbarity and the cruelty of it. Actually, when you read what the LCCs and others are saying, is a set of moral principles for the Free Syrian Army fighters to adhere to. They don't always adhere to it, don't get me wrong, I'm not going to whitewash this. But that there is an attempt constantly to remain, we have a moral high ground here. And it's very, very important that we do, excuse me, that we do that. That the Syrian revolution is part of the wider Arab revolutions, and that if you see, and people I think sometimes feel a little bit isolated, I know I felt a little bit isolated, when you stand up amongst much of the traditional left, and they go, you are the only people who support the Syrian revolution. Well, yeah, just us, the Egyptians, the Tunisians, the Yemenis, and so on. Just us and the Arab revolutions support the Syrian revolution. I think it's fascinating the way in which with the rise, especially of President Morsi inside of Egypt, how Syria is such an important question. That actually, you begin to see that this is a much, much bigger thing. The sympathy amongst the Arab world for the Syrian people is absolutely huge. And as the revolutions develop more and more inside of the Arab world, you can see a future for Syria not being isolated, but one being drawn into a completely changing Arab world. I am so optimistic, despite the horror. I am absolutely optimistic because, I'll make a confession. I used to drive to the Rapar Valley, which is between Syria and Lebanon, because I used to have lovely food there. And I always used to pass the statue of Assaf, because, and I won't tell you why it's there, but it was there. And even though I was in the car with all my friends, none of us said what we thought. And I'd go back and I went, one day that statue is going to come down. But I wouldn't tell any of my friends because they think I'm completely mad. It wasn't until the statue started coming down that everyone started confessing, I thought that would happen. And there's something else I have to say, which is, I never had, until the revolution, a political conversation with a Syrian. No, you never had or a Libyan, for that matter. You never approached it. And it was very important because our village in the north of Lebanon depended on Syrian agricultural workers to bring in the olives and so on. So it isn't like I never met a Syrian. When we were rebuilding a house in Beirut, which had been shelled just by everybody, Syrian workers came and did it. And what was very interesting, the closest I came to a political discussion was when, I asked the shopkeeper, house had taken so much damage over the years, does he know anyone reliable? He said, yes, I know a very good guy, but he's Syrian, do you mind? I said, I don't care, does he paint? He goes, yeah, he paints, okay. So he came anyway, so we were doing a tour, and it was like a tour of the Lebanese Civil War. Because it was like, this was the Palestinians, this rocket here, this was M16, this came from here, this came from the faction fight, and so on. We did all the front. And he was going, yes, you need this here, you need that, filler, this type of filler, and so on. And we went to behind the building, which had been hit by Syrian shelling, and he went silent. He said, this part we do for free. And I said, no, that's, I don't blame you. You're not responsible for what the Syrian regime did. This was in 1989. He went, no, shut up. This we do for free. That was the closest I came to a political discussion with a Syrian. Now you can't shut them up. Really, you can't shut them up. They will talk about everything, and I think this is the fantastic thing. Awoken spirit of revolution. Millions of people taking control, attempting to take control of their lives, but in the process we have to destroy this regime. We have to destroy the regime of fear, and we have to also remember that there is, even though it's outside of our memory, because I was born in 1963, 3 months after the state of emergency went in Syria. So even all my life, I don't know anything about the state of emergency in Syria. But you read about Syria in the 1940s, the 1950s and 1960s, understanding this was the birthplace of Arab nationalism, huge cultural explosion, huge political. It was fantastic. It was a centre, I think, for many people of sort of what they call the Arab Renaissance culture. That was destroyed by the dictatorship that followed. And this is what you're seeing re-emerging. So I have absolute hope in the victory, and I think the victory will come soon. And long live Syria, free and with dignity.